Ooh. When it comes to fishing in cold water, there are a lot of different baits that can work really well. But whether you fish in ponds or rivers or lakes, one of the best cold water lures there is a jig. A jig really kind of can mimic a lot of different forage that a bass eats. And I catch fish on jigs throughout the entire winter. Now, there are a few things that I do with a jig, also when selecting a jig for cold water, that is a lot different than when fishing it in other times of the year. And so in this video, we're gonna talk all about cold water jig fishing, so stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. This video is brought to you by my apparel company, Fin Fishing. Right now at Fin Fishing, the Black Friday sales have begun and everything on the website, except for rod gloves, is 20% off. So now is a great time to save money on buying USA-made sun shirts, bass hats, sun gloves, and the all-new duck shorts. These are a highly durable, water-resistant short that I think are the best shorts out there. So I'm gonna leave some links down below in the description and in the comments. Shopping at Fin Fishing is truly the best way to help support this channel. I greatly appreciate all of you who have done so. Now, one of the first things that I think about when it comes to fishing a jig in colder water is the presence of your jig. And what I mean by the presence of your jig is really kind of the size of that jig. If you look at the two different jigs that I'm holding right here, you can tell that they are a lot different in size. This one is vastly different with a big crawl style trailer, and this one is a lot smaller with a more of a chunk style trailer. And when it comes to fishing in cold water, I have found that the really big jigs are not the best option. Now, with that being said, it's very important to understand what cold water is for each of you, depending on where you live in the country. If you live in the South, cold water might only be 55 degrees, maybe 50 degrees. And in that type of water temperature, I still can get bit on a bigger than average jig. But once you really start kind of falling below that 50-degree mark, when you get into the 40s, even the upper 30s, I really switch over to fishing a lot smaller jig, one that doesn't have near as big of a presence. And one of the biggest reasons for that is that during the winter and during cold water, a bass's metabolism is going to slow. So therefore, they really just do not need near as much food. They don't need to eat near as often in order to kind of sustain them day to day. You know, if they ate a bluegill during the winter, it may last them for an entire week. Where if they eat that same bluegill during the summer, it may only give them enough energy for a day. So bass are not necessarily eating huge prey during this time of year, and I find that I just get a lot more bites and the same size as like big fish on a jig when I'm fishing those smaller, more compact jigs. Now, over the years, there's a number of jigs that I have fished during winter and during cold water months that I really, really like. A Strike King Bitsy Bug is a very inexpensive jig that I fish a lot. And that's also great because you are going to lose jigs from time to time. So losing a $2 jig doesn't like break the bank. But when it comes to like a premium jig, one that I've really grown fond of over the last like year or so is the Outcast Tackle Cage Fighter jig. To me, this little jig is very, very powerful. And one of the biggest things that I love about this jig is that, one, it has a great hook in it. It has a stout hook. It's not going to flex out on you. If you go down the Walmart, you know, or Bass Pro Shop aisle and look in the bargain bins, you're going to find some really cheap jigs. And one thing that those cheap jigs always have is a really crappy hook in them, one that is going to bend out. Now, the Cage Fighter jig doesn't have that. It has a really good quality hook. It's also a tungsten jig, so it is a little bit more expensive when it comes to price, but it gives you a lot more compact profile, a smaller presence in the water. And like I said, in cold water, I really think that this matters. The other added benefit of a tungsten jig is that you're just going to be able to feel the bottom a little bit better. Tungsten is a lot harder. It translates what is down there on the bottom throughout the entire system a lot better. So I can tell a lot easier if I'm coming through rock versus coming through shell, or coming around a wood, or coming through grass, whatever it may be, that tungsten really allows you to feel that bottom. Now, real quick side note, since we're talking about jig presence, has anyone actually caught a bass on the Ike's Monster Jig? This is a 1 ounce, $15 lure that literally has a tuna hook in it. I mean, look at the size of this hook versus the hook in this Outcast tackle jig. This thing is a monster, and really, I just want to know, has anyone caught a bass on this thing? Let me know down below in the comments. Now, just because I like a smaller presence when I'm fishing a jig during the winter months and during cold water, that doesn't necessarily mean that I always want a smaller jig as far as the weight of the jig. I will definitely say that if I am working a jig across the bottom where I'm hopping it a lot, for example, one of my favorite places to fish a jig is around bluffs, where I'm going to cast it up onto a bluff bank and kind of work that bait, stair step it down. Now, when I'm working that bait, I'm actually lifting it up and letting it fall vertically down. And in that situation, I do like a lighter jig, something more of like a 3/8 ounce jig, even a 1/4 ounce jig at times, because that slow fall in cold water just tends to look more natural to a bass, and it definitely tends to get more bites. But if I am casting a jig, maybe I'm casting it over a point and I'm fishing it through a rock pile in the middle of winter when it's really cold out, the size of the jig doesn't necessarily matter in that situation. I can use a 1/2 ounce jig. I can use a 3/4 ounce jig because I am simply dragging that bait across the bottom. Now, I will say that I think that lighter jigs look more natural when you are fishing them on offshore places where you're just dragging it. So the lightest weight that I can get away with does still tend to be the one that I'm going to fish. But if you are dragging that bait down there and you're fishing in 30 foot of water, using a 3/4 ounce weight may be necessary just so that you can have a good feel of the bottom. So just because I want a smaller jig presence doesn't always necessarily mean I want a smaller jig weight. Now, when it comes to fishing a jig in cold water, I believe that the trailer that you decide to use actually really makes a big impact on the number of bites that you'll get. I think that most of the year when you're fishing this in, warmer water or even really hot water, I don't always think that the type of jig trailer that you go with is really going to make that big of a difference. But in cold water, I really believe that chunk style trailers get a lot more bites than kind of your flapping crawl style trailers. During the winter, like we've talked about, a bass's metabolism slow. Everything is a little bit slower. And with that being said, it just seems like bass don't tend to like a lot of action in their baits. That is why some of the best cold water lures are ones that have very little action at all. I mean, think of a Ned rig or a shaky head or even a jig head minnow. These baits do not have a lot of action to them. They're pretty much just kind of a stick bait. But in cold water months, I really believe that that is the action that bass really like. And a chunk style trailer like this really doesn't have a lot of action. And that is why I kind of stick with the chunk style trailers in the middle of winter. Now, something that I like to do a lot with my chunk trailers in the winter is I actually like to feed them on to the shank of the hook. Sometimes I will simply just hang a chunk style trailer just like that. But in the winter, when I want that really compact, bait, kind of like what we're talking about, I'm actually going to feed it up onto the hook shank like so and push it up on. And that really gives you a small profile jig. And this one's kind of a little crooked, but that thing will get you a lot of bites. And real quick, I know that some of you may ask, why did you put a black and blue trailer on a green pumpkin jig? And this is something that I just experiment from time to time. There's a lot of times where I'm just gonna match my jig trailer and my jig, going with the green pumpkin trailer on a green pumpkin jig, a black and blue trailer with the black and blue jig. But there are times where I do kind of just like to experiment. And something that we know that is scientifically based is that bass like a contrast in colors. That's why crankbaits a lot of times will have like a black back with kind of a, you know, yellow or whatever shad type side, because when that contrast, when that crankbait is going through the water and it sees that contrast, those two different colors, that actually kind of entices a bass to hitting that bait. The same thing to me applies with some of your soft plastics. And so every now and then I like to have a contrast in colors. I know for me, one of my favorite flipping baits is a Berkeley Pit Boss. My absolute favorite color is called Bama Bass, and it is like a green pumpkin on one side and then like a June bug on the other side. And I swear that thing gets so many bites for me, and I really think it's because of the contrasting in colors. As that thing is going through the water, sometimes the bass see green pumpkin, sometimes they see the June bug color, and I think that it just entices them to catch a bass. So every now and then, I do like to have a contrast with my jig and my trailer. Now, when it comes to the rod, reel, and line that I like to use while fishing a jig, this can kind of vary greatly depending on what style of jig fishing you are doing. In the winter, when I'm fishing a little bit more compact jigs, the one rod that I go with is kind of like my all-around jig rod. It's a 7-foot, 3-inch Moneymaker rod by Arc. This is a fast action rod that is also a heavy power rod. To me, it's really the perfect all-around jig rod. Now, I'm gonna use that jig a lot of times with about 14 or 15 pound test, unless I'm fishing it around heavy cover where I will bump it up to 20 pound straight fluorocarbon. Now, when it comes to the reel that I like to use, I really like a faster reel when I'm fishing a jig, because you're not really using the reel to kind of move the lure, you're using the rod a lot. So it's just nice to have a fast reel to pick up the slack in your line. So something that is over 8, you know, 8.1 to 1 is really what I use with my jigs. You could definitely get away with using like a 7.3 to 1 gear ratio reel as well. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about when it comes to fishing a jig is, where does a jig work in cold water? And if I'm being honest, a jig can work absolutely anywhere. And that's really one of the powers of a jig, and why I like a jig so much is because you can fish it in really skinny water. I mean, you can flip and pitch a jig into wood cover, into grass cover, and catch bass like that during the winter down in the south. You can also fish it on creek channel swing banks and bluff style banks, walking it down. You can fish it on offshore structure, on points, on humps, on ledges, targeting shell beds and brush piles. You can really fish a jig anywhere during the winter and catch a lot of bass. Now, the one place that you do want to concentrate on when it comes to fishing a jig in the winter and in cold water months is really an area that is close or adjacent to deeper water. And deep water can mean a little bit of everything. I mean, in a pond, this might be 8 to 10 foot of water. In a bigger lake, this might be 20 or 30 foot of water. But when you have cold water, bass like to have deep water access. They like to have a place that when it gets really cold, they can easily shift down a couple of feet and be in a very comfortable zone. They're not going to be way up on top of a flat where they have to travel 100 yards to get to deep water. They like to have that deep water access close by. That is the #1 place where I'm going to pick up a jig. Now, if you guys want to watch a video of me kind of breaking down a body of water, fishing it in a little bit cold water, I used a jig in this video. I also used a jerk bait a little bit in this video, and I'm gonna leave it linked right here. So if you guys enjoyed this video, I think you'll like this one. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.